Hello everyone, this is Ashley Tucker. Thank you for joining me today. I have a couple more cards to share with you today for the Colorado Craft Company release. If you missed my video a couple days ago, Colorado Craft Company is running some really great promotions on their website right now. I will have details about those on my blog post. And also, if you haven't checked out the release, I would recommend checking it out. I'll have a link for that in the description down below. I decided to bust out my alcohol inks for these cards. I haven't played with these inks for quite a while, but I find that they are always perfect if you want a really stunning background. The paper that I'm using is 5x7 Yupo paper from Ranger. Yupo paper is a synthetic paper, which is kind of a plastic material. It's really good for alcohol inks if you want results like this, because the alcohol inks can move around on it really easily and it can handle a lot of liquid. The alcohol inks that I'm using are the Tim Holtz Ranger alcohol inks, and I'm using the colors Purple Twilight, Wild Plum, Pink Sherbet, and Pool. And please don't judge me for saying sherbet instead of sherbet. I was raised saying sherbet, and it sounds really weird to me to say sherbet. Anyway, I'm dropping those inks onto the paper pretty randomly, and then I'm also adding on some blending solution as well as isopropyl alcohol. Now, you don't have to use both of those. You could use one or the other. I actually probably would recommend just getting a bottle of isopropyl alcohol from the drugstore because it's pretty cheap in comparison to the blending solution, and I think they both work pretty similarly. You can see that in the middle of adding all of this liquid onto the paper, I'm using a straw in order to blow it around and get that ink really moving. I really like the look that that creates. I set that first panel aside to dry and I started working on a second one. Whenever I take out my alcohol inks, I can't make just one. I always have to do a few. It's kind of addictive. Something that I find always happens to me when I'm working with alcohol inks, I don't know if this is just me or if it's something that happens to a lot of people, but I will be liking the panel a lot, and then about halfway through working with it, I'll do something to it and I will hate it, and I'll think that I totally ruined it. But I usually keep with it and keep adding to it or changing it, and in the end, I really like it. The thing about working with alcohol inks is they can change so fast. So if you are really liking your panel, stop. Don't add anything else because that could change really quickly. Or if you did something and it made you not like your panel anymore, keep going with it because you can change it to the point where you like it again. Just keep going with it. Another thing that changes the way that your panel looks and could determine whether you like it or not is if you add foil to it. I'm going to be adding foil to this panel. I picked out a piece of gold foil. I let the panel dry for about half a minute, not too long, and I placed the foil on top, and the way that I get it to stick is by really pressing it into the paper. The more you press it, the more you're going to have stick. I do find that the foil sticks to the areas on your panel that are darker, probably because those areas are more saturated with ink, so they stay sticky longer. So that's just something to keep in mind when you're deciding whether or not to use foil. I'm going to be using some of the new Savvy Sentiments line from Colorado Craft Company. This is a new stamp line that they just started a month or two ago, and I have been really loving it. It has some really beautiful sentiments. I'm going to be embossing one of the sentiments right onto one of my alcohol ink panels. As you could see before, I was testing out the panel with my embossing powder to see if any of it would stick to the panel. Alcohol ink tends to need a little while to dry, so I highly recommend testing it with your powder before embossing so that you can make sure that you don't have any issues. I also prepped this panel with a powder tool before I stamped with Versamark ink, and I made sure to pull up my Misti door really slowly because I have that foil on the page, and if I were to pull up that door really quickly, the Versamark ink on the stamp might pull up some of that foil, so you want to take your time with it. I do have one little spot on the sentiment where the Versamark ink did lift up some of that foil, so it didn't get any embossing powder on it, but it was just a really tiny little spot, so it didn't really bother me. You can see that as I'm heating up the embossing powder, I'm taking it really slowly, and this is even sped up a little bit, so I went even slower than this. Like I mentioned before, Yupo paper is a synthetic paper that is made out of a kind of plastic, so heating it up is kind of difficult to do because it warps really easily. So in order to prevent as much warping as possible, I'm using my heat tool in short bursts on the paper. So that sentiment came from the thank you stamp set, and this second sentiment, which is going to be on my second card, comes from the large love quotes stamp set, and I decided to stamp this on some vellum. I have a strip of vellum, which I prepped with my powder bag, and I stamped that in Versamark ink, and then I'm embossing it with Alabaster white embossing powder from Brutus Monroe. Vellum is also one that you have to be careful with when you're using the heat tool, but it is definitely more forgiving than the Yupo paper. Now, because my Yupo paper did have a little bit of warping, I decided to adhere it to my card base with foam tape. I find that when you use a bunch of foam tape to adhere something that's warped, it tends to straighten it out a little bit. I created a 5x7 frame for this card using the nested Hero Arts rectangle dies, and I offset the center of that frame so that it's higher up. It kind of reminded me of when I was in photography in college. Every time we had to present some of our work, we would have to mount it in these frames that always were offset a little bit high, and I really kind of liked that look for these cards. I added a few of these Lucy's Cards raindrop embellishments around the sentiment, and then this card was done. For my second card, I adhered my alcohol ink panel onto a 5x7 card base with my tape runner. I didn't have to use foam tape for this one because there was no warping. I created a second frame identical to the first one, and I'm going to be adhering that vellum strip across the frame on the back. So I just added a little bit of that tape runner adhesive on the sides, lined up the strip where I wanted it, and then pressed down to adhere it. I used a pair of scissors in order to carefully cut off the excess vellum on each of the sides. I added one layer of foam tape all the way around the back of my frame, and then I very carefully lined it up onto my card and placed it. Just like with the first card, I finished this one with a few raindrop embellishments. When you have a really gorgeous background like this with lots of detail, you don't want to add a lot of embellishments to distract from it. That finishes up both of these cards. I hope you really enjoyed watching. If you're curious about any of the supplies I used, I have links to everything in the description down below. I also have a link to the Colorado Craft Company release as well as my blog post. I do have a giveaway going on. If you want to find out more about that, head over to my blog post. If you liked watching today and you want to see more videos from me, be sure to hit that subscribe button. I do new videos every single week, and I'm going to be back with another one really soon. Again, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate all of you, and I'll see you next time.